Hey guys, tonight we're drifting way back to a city that floats, glimmers, and smells faintly of crushed marigolds and fried maize. You're standing at the edge of a shallow lake, the water lapping against your ankles, and before you stretches an impossible city, Tenochtitlan. It shimmers in the morning haze rising from the heart of Lake Texcoco, like a mirage you could walk into. Causeway roads stretch over the water like ribbons. Canoes glide past stacked pyramids and market stalls bursting with goods. The scent is half fish, half fried cactus, and just a whisper of wet mud. Welcome to the Venice of the Americas, and here's your first dose of Aztec reality. This lake-bound capital supports hundreds of thousands of people. And yet, spoiler alert, there are no wheat fields in sight. So, how are they eating? Well, brace yourself, because it involves a lot of mud sticks and some of the most ingenious gardening hacks you've never heard of. It's impressive, it's sustainable, and yes, it's all happening without a single tractor or fertilizer bag in sight. But don't get too inspired. You probably wouldn't survive 2 hours out here without a tetanus shot and a very strong stomach. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, I'd love to know, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You squelch forward your sandals, sinking into the wet shoreline. Lake Texcoco is more like a wide, brackish puddle in parts. The water is shallow and salty, not exactly spa day material, but the Aztecs built their whole empire around it. Literally. Unlike most cities which just battle nature, they partnered with it. Instead of draining the swamp, they gardened on it. Behind you, a priest chants at the Templo Mayor. Ahead, 2 boys paddle past with baskets of squash blossoms. And right beside you, an island, not a real island, mind you. This is something far more clever. It's floating. Well, sort of. It's anchored to the lake bed with willow trees and stuffed full of lake mud and compost. But to your modern eyes, it looks like someone just dragged a garden bed out into the water and dared it not to sink. Historians still argue whether the idea of chinampas, these so-called floating gardens, originated with the Aztecs or earlier cultures like the Xochimilca. But by the time of Moctezuma, they were everywhere, long, narrow platforms laid out like checkerboard rows, separated by tiny canals where paddle boats moved silently like ghosts in the mist. Each one brims with color, corn stalks, bean vines, chili bushes. Occasionally, a heron struts through like it owns the place. Here's your mainstream fact. Tenochtitlan had somewhere between 200,000 to 300,000 residents at its peak. That made it one of the largest cities in the world in the 15th century, right up there with Paris or Beijing. And they fed almost all of them using chinampas, mostly without importing food from other regions. No refrigerated caravans. No bar-coded kale from the other side of the empire. Just local, lovingly maintained swamp dirt. Of course, lovingly maintained might be putting it gently. These gardens required constant attention. The lake didn't stay in one place, it had moods. Flooding in the wet season, drying in the hot months, and full-on temper tantrums if the gods weren't properly appeased. You'll hear more about those tantrums later. Think floating cabbages swirling past your house, kind of vibe. But for now, just know that even the act of gardening here was an act of quiet rebellion against a landscape that wanted very badly to swallow everything whole. Speaking of swallowing you, a nearby vendor's canoe tied to a post. He's selling tamales fragrant and wrapped in corn husks, bobbing gently beside his field like a lunchbox adrift. Not a bad way to do break time. Farmers here didn't walk between plots. They paddled. Everything was by boat: tools, seeds, snacks, gossip. Think of it as agriculture meets Venice, but with more mosquitoes and fewer gelatos. But here's a quirky tidbit. Chinampas were so fertile, Aztec farmers could harvest up to 7 crops a year. 7. That's like planting your basil and watching it become a salad bar buffet before summer's even done. Part of the magic was in the mud rich in decayed plants, fish bits, and something we'll talk about later involving human waste. You'll love that part, or hate it. Hard to say. Still, it's mesmerizing. You step onto one of the islands, careful not to disturb the rows of amaranth, and the ground squishes slightly underfoot. It's firm enough to walk on, but it's definitely alive in a way your backyard soil has never been. You can smell the earthiness, the brine, the fresh pepper leaves crushed under a canoe's paddle. A woman in a woven dress waves at you. She's planting beans in the classic Three Sisters configuration corn, in the middle beans spiraling up the stalk squash, spreading wide to keep the moisture in. You give her a nod and pretend not to trip on a clump of mud the size of a grapefruit. By now, the sun is climbing, the birds are shrieking, and you're realizing just how intricate this system really is. It's not random gardening, it's engineered. The canals aren't just for transport. They regulate water flow, reduce erosion, and keep the roots from drowning. The crops are rotated, the reeds trimmed, the islands reshaped every few years, like natural Legos. And when one starts to sink or go bad, they just build another, right beside it. This is no primitive system cobbled together with hope and corn stalks. This is urban planning disguised as rustic charm, and somehow it works. For centuries, it works. You crouch to run your hand along the edge of the plot. It's lined with woven branches and packed with sticky lake mud. From this close, you notice something odd. The outline of an old rotted fish skeleton embedded in the side, grinning up at you. Like a reminder of how thin the line is between life and decay out here. But for now, the garden lives. The city thrives. And so do you, though you'll want to watch your step on the way back to the canoe. This mud has claimed many a sandal. You're back on your canoe now, knees sore from crouching hands. A little muddier than you'd like, but something has shifted. You can feel it. These floating farms aren't some weird ecological fluke. They're deliberate, calculated, and shockingly effective. You dip your fingers into the water and watch the ripples spread. Beneath you lies the secret to Aztec agriculture, a living network of islands made from, well, basically swamp goo and human willpower. Let's break this miracle down. It starts with mud. But not just any mud, lake bottom sludge sticky with organic decay and nutrients. Add to that a scaffold of sticks and reeds, and you've got the basic skeleton of a chinampa. Sounds simple, right? But oh no, the Aztecs weren't just tossing muck around. This was architecture. Step 1, pick your spot. Not too deep, not too shallow. Then jab long wooden stakes, often willow branches, into the lake bed to form a rectangle. The willows would take root and grow into living anchors, their roots helping hold the island in place like fingers curling into mud. Between the stakes, you'd weave a basket-like base of reed sticks and branches. Call it The garden's underpants, if you like. Step 2, start piling. Mud algae, decayed vegetation, more mud bits of trash, and yes, fish guts. You layer this lovely Aztec lasagna until it rises above the waterline by about a meter or so. The top layer gets a pat down and maybe a sprinkle of ash to help with pests. Voila. One chinampa. Historians still argue whether this method was born purely out of necessity or evolved from religious rituals tied to earth and water spirits. Either way, the design stuck. And here's the kicker: once built, these islands could last for decades, even centuries, with proper maintenance. That's right, a garden made of sticks and muck could outlive an empire. You pause as a dragonfly skims past your nose, its wings catching the light like shards of turquoise glass. The air hums with life. Somewhere nearby, someone's playing a flute badly. You drift between 2 rows of chinampas, and it feels almost too perfect, like you're gliding through a carefully curated museum exhibit rather than the agricultural backbone of an ancient megacity. The quirky tidbit here: chinampas didn't just float in the middle of nowhere. They were often built around the edges of the lake or on top of naturally occurring islets and marshlands. Technically, they weren't fully floating. They were semi-permanent, almost amphibious platforms. But to your eyes, they defy logic. Like a vegetable garden that got tired of land and decided to take a swim. And this is where the Aztecs showed off their real flex, scaling the system. One garden is neat. 100 gardens are a village. But thousands, that's empire territory. By the time the Spanish arrived, the southern part of Lake Texcoco, especially near Xochimilco and Tlahuac, was a checkerboard of green. Imagine looking out from a temple top and seeing endless rows of crops shimmering on water, stretching all the way to the horizon. You hear the swish of water as another canoe glides by loaded with bundles of maize squash and beans, the classic Aztec trio. The farmer gives you a nod, his paddle smooth, and practice the boat loaded like a floating farmer's market. Now here's a mainstream fact for you. The chinampa system could yield up to 7 harvests per year. Not 1, not 2, 7. Thanks to the rich sediment and near-constant attention from farmers, the system provided a near-continuous supply of food. This was how Tenochtitlan managed to feed hundreds of thousands without importing tons of grain from distant provinces. That's not just impressive, it's mind-boggling. Of course, not everything about this system was serene. Imagine hauling lake mud every week, shoveling it onto a raft that wants nothing more than to sink under you. Imagine fighting off invasive water hyacinths or patching leaks after a particularly bad rain. And heaven forbid a willow tree died, your entire plot could start shifting. Still, there's an elegant logic to it. Build the frame, add mud, grow food, feed your family, repair the damage, repeat. You think of it like one of those looping YouTube videos, oddly satisfying, endlessly repeating just the right cadence to lull you to sleep. Except here it comes with back pain and mosquito bites. You float past a particularly wide chinampa, its rows neat and symmetrical. A man in a jaguar-patterned cloak, likely a higher-ranking farmer, or maybe just someone with flair, is digging carefully with a wooden hoe. He's turning the soil, checking for grubs, muttering something about rainfall. You can't hear exactly what he's saying, but the rhythm of his work is hypnotic. Dig, turn, check. Dig, turn, check. The soil here is unlike anything you've seen. Black, loamy, rich, with the scent of wet leaves and sweet rot. You scoop a bit into your hand and squeeze. It's damp, pliable, and alive with microbial chatter. This is the stuff of empire, not gold, not jade. Just dirt. ingeniously engineered dirt. Your canoe bumps gently against another Chinampa. A woman with a reed hat eyes you with suspicion. She's stacking bundles of dried reeds, probably for more fencing or to shore up the edges of her island. She waves you off gently but firmly, and you paddle onward. Here's another fringe detail some archaeologists believe Chinampas had spiritual significance. Offerings have been found buried beneath them, small figurines, obsidian knives, even animal bones. It's possible each new island was a kind of sacred birth, a patch of earth brought forth from water and consecrated with gifts. Farming in this view wasn't just labor, it was ritual. And that fits, doesn't it? You can feel it as the sun starts to dip, this sense that the lake, the mud, the plants, it's all part of something bigger, something engineered but organic, practical but mystical, and still, after centuries, utterly mesmerizing. A breeze kicks up. The water laps gently against the boat's sides. Somewhere in the reeds a frog croaks like it's trying out for a solo. You close your eyes for a moment and let the rhythm of this place settle into your bones. The sun is almost gone now. Shadows stretch long across the Chinampas and the air cools just enough to raise the hair on your arms. It's time to paddle back, slowly, carefully. The mud may be rich, but it doesn't forgive clumsy steps. Still, as you turn toward shore, you can't help but look back. Those islands behind you. They weren't just gardens. They were resilience designed in layers, floating forever between water and sky. The paddle dips once more into the still water, and you glide forward, drawn deeper into this watery patchwork quilt of fields and canals. Each stroke carries you past rows of corn and squash, glowing golden in the early light, past plots, carefully mounded like green spines rising from the surface of the lake. You start to wonder something, how did these plants, these poor, soggy, half-drowned plants, not just rot to mush? Welcome to the secret heart of Chinampa. Engineering the roots. Now you might think growing on soggy islands would be a moldy disaster. But the Aztecs, as it turns out, were miles ahead of you, and miles ahead of a lot of modern farmers too. The base material in a Chinampa wasn't just mud. It was a calculated blend of lake sediment, decayed aquatic vegetation, and organic refuse that allowed water to wick upward, feeding roots from below without ever drowning them. Picture it like a perfectly damp sponge under a houseplant, but make it the size of a city. Here's the mainstream fact: Chinampas used a method similar to what we now call sub-irrigation. The lake's water would seep naturally into the Chinampa from the sides and bottom, keeping the roots hydrated without waterlogging them. There was no need for irrigation ditches or hoses. Nature did the plumbing, and for pest control, many farmers added ashes, chili powders, or even crushed shells to the topsoil. It's like compost meets medieval pesticide, all natural, all biodegradable, and mostly designed to convince bugs to feast somewhere else. Historians still argue whether Chinampa farmers rotated their crops methodically or stuck to traditional Three Sisters planting. But either way, the soil rarely sat idle, and weeds didn't stand a chance under such careful eyes. You watch as a farmer dips a clay bowl into the canal and pours water along the base of a row of beans, not to water them, but to invite fish and insects to the surface. A kind of low-tech fertilizer detector. If the fish squirm upward, the plot's doing well. If not, time to muck in more sludge. And here's a fringe tidbit for your sleepy brain. Some chinampas were engineered with slight elevation slopes, letting excess water drain gently back into the canals. That's right. Ancient Mesoamericans were out here making microgradient beds centuries before the phrase ever showed up in a permaculture blog. It's all very subtle, barely noticeable to the eye, but it kept the roots breathing and the crops upright even during a heavy rain, which, by the way, happened a lot. Lake Texcoco was moody like a house cat with a thundercloud problem. 1 week placid and calm, the next sloshing its brackish water over your lovingly arranged maize rows like an angry toddler flipping a cereal bowl. This lake was a shallow, salty inland sea fed by seasonal rains, and when those rains came hard, the water levels could rise fast. Entire chinampa blocks could vanish beneath water overnight if farmers weren't paying attention or if the gods were particularly grumpy. That's why some plots had small retaining berms around the edges, carefully built from clay and reeds to hold their shape. These weren't high enough to stop flooding entirely, but they helped buffer the blow. Kind of like sandbags, if sandbags were made out of woven lake grass and prayers. The water is glassy today, but you spot remnants of a sunken chinampa nearby, just the tips of a few willows poking up their twisted limbs like fingers reaching back toward the sky. A reminder that the system wasn't perfect. The lake always won in the end. Still, you can't help but admire how these floating farms danced the line between aquatic and terrestrial. They weren't on land, they weren't quite in the water. They were both and neither. The roots reached downward into moisture, while the leaves lifted toward the sun in obedient rows. The farmers, they just kept everything balanced like tightrope walkers with mud on their hands. As you float, a man steers past you in a canoe filled with bundled reeds. He's heading to shore to reinforce his plots. You nod to him, and he grins, gold teeth flashing. He points behind you and mutters something in Nahuatl that sounds suspiciously like, "You're drifting." And you are. Just a bit. So you steer yourself back, trailing one hand in the water, feeling the push and pull of it. The canal narrows slightly, and now you're in the older part of the system. Some of these chinampas have been here for generations. That tree to your right, it was planted 50 years ago by a farmer whose name nobody remembers, but whose roots still hold the island in place. You pass a marker stone barely visible above the surface, etched with a faded glyph, a maize stalk and 2 water lines. The symbolism is clear. Life grows in layers here. You stop paddling and drift for a moment, letting your eyes trace the straight rows of plants, the dark ridges of earth, the flutter of butterfly wings along the chili blossoms. Somewhere, a heron lets out a dignified squawk, offended that you dared to exist near its fishing spot. And here's something to ponder as you watch the dragonflies dance. The soil isn't just fertile, it's self-renewing. Farmers dredged the lake bottom regularly to scoop up new layers of nutrient-rich sediment and pile it onto their chinampas. The act of farming became part of the lake's cycle. Nothing wasted, nothing static. Dirt water plants decay repeat, a system designed not just to grow food but to regenerate itself. Of course, that doesn't mean it was all peaceful flower farming. We'll get into tribute taxes and warrior gardeners later. But for now, just imagine what it feels like to tend to a garden that literally grows itself back every time you cut it down. Not magic, not miracles, just mastery. You glance down again at the edge of a plot where the soil crumbles gently into the canal. Tiny green shoots poke through the edge like fingers testing the air. Life is stubborn here. It clings, it spreads, it floats. You paddle on, slowly, your arms moving in steady rhythm, hypnotized by the gleaming water and the green walls that rise on either side. The sun is higher now, casting a golden shimmer on the water. It's warm, sleepy, a perfect day for floating gardens. And maybe a nap. Your paddle nudges aside a bundle of duckweed as you drift into another corridor of green. This stretch of chinampas feels older, tighter, a little wilder. The willows grow denser here, their roots braided into the water like tangled hair, their branches bent low as if whispering secrets to the corn. The scent is strong, earthy sweet, a blend of lake and loam, and the air hums with bees hard at work. You're not here to harvest. You're here to build, or at least to watch others do it. Because chinampas weren't just planted, they were woven. Imagine this: you're an Aztec farmer, handed a patch of soggy mosquito-infested marsh and told, make it grow. No tractor, no fertilizer, no raised beds from your local hardware store. Just lake sludge sticks and an unshakable belief in the power of geometry. First, you start with fencing. Long, flexible reeds ahuejote trees, cousins of the willow, are driven into the lake bed to form the perimeter of your new chinampa. These trees aren't just markers, they're anchors. Over time, their roots will interlace with those of neighboring trees, linking the whole network like veins in a leaf. Next comes the weaving. Between these stakes, you thread branches, rushes, and reeds, forming a living fence. It's a bit like making a really big soggy basket, but one that will hold half a ton of mud. Over several days or weeks, depending on how many relatives you can guilt into helping you pile in lake-bottom muck-decaying vegetation and old compost. A layer here, a sprinkle there. Let it settle. Then pile again. The result, a raised rectangle of fertile soil surrounded by canals and anchored by trees. It doesn't float like a raft, but it feels like it might, flexing slightly under your step, damp at the edges, always pulsing with water beneath. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The chinampa method was so productive that Spanish chroniclers were baffled. Hernán Cortés himself described the farms as gardens of the gods, amazed at how something so fragile-looking could feed a city larger than Seville. What they didn't see was the centuries of innovation buried in every mud-packed layer. You squint up at a farmer working on one now. He's knee-deep in muck, his feet invisible beneath the brown water. With slow, methodical movements, he lays another reed across the edge, then slaps it with a flat paddle to seal it into the frame. A child follows behind, tossing handfuls of algae and crushed shells into the pile like he's feeding a strange green monster. And now, for a delightfully fringed tidbit, some scholars believe certain chinampas were engineered with lunar cycles in mind, built or planted on dates believed to align with fertility phases of the moon. Is that science, maybe? Is it superstition? Also maybe. Historians still argue whether lunar timing was about tradition, celestial reverence, or simply a good excuse to avoid work on cloudy nights. You float closer to a half-built chinampa and run your fingers over its woven edge. The texture is rough, fibrous, and scratchy, like a doormat left out in the rain. But it holds. All around you, the proof sprouts in vibrant rows, chilies, tomatoes, maize. None of it here by accident. Every inch is planned. It wasn't just utility, it was artistry. Chinampas were narrow by design, often only 2.5 to 4 meters wide, but as long as 100 meters. That shape let the water flow freely, prevented stagnation, and made it easier for canoes to pass. It also meant the sunlight reached both sides of the crops evenly. Aztec farmers were doing layout optimization centuries before CAD software. You steer your canoe through the canal like threading a needle between green blades. On one side, a woman in a flower-dyed tunic drops seeds into small clay holes along the edge of a new plot. On the other, two men haul sopping reed mats from the water, slapping them down into place like chefs laying lasagna noodles. And remember those willows. They weren't just for structure. Their roots filtered the water. That's right, natural filtration. As water passed through the roots and the soil beneath the chinampa, impurities were captured, sediment slowed, and nutrients trapped. It wasn't a passive system, it was actively cycling water quality. Welcome to Aztec bioengineering, as you pause to take this all in the air shifts. A light breeze moves across the water, rippling the duckweed, fluttering the corn tassels. You hear the call of a distant bird, something shrill and wild. For a moment, it feels like the lake is breathing around you, and here comes your classic scholarly spat. Some argue that chinampas were exclusively for small-scale farmers and families. Others claim they were part of state-run infrastructure controlled by nobility and enforced through tribute. It's likely both. Some plots were handed down through generations. Others were seized, redistributed, or taxed into oblivion by local officials, with too much authority and too little oversight. You paddle past a chinampa with stone boundary markers, an unusual sight, likely owned by a wealthier family. These boundary stones bear glyphs etched in faint spirals, perhaps names, perhaps harvest records, or perhaps warnings. You're not sure, and the farmers around here aren't telling. Nearby, two young boys splash in the water, racing makeshift toy canoes carved from gourds. They shout and laugh, their feet kicking up clouds of silt, momentarily clouding the clarity of the canal. A heron takes flight overhead, annoyed at the ruckus. In the distance, you hear a conch horn echo across the lake. A signal, maybe a festival, a call to dinner, no idea, but it rolls over the water like thunder, grounding you again in the scale of this place. The lake isn't just backdrop, it's infrastructure. As you drift, a faint smile tugs at the corners of your mouth. This system shouldn't work. It breaks half a dozen modern farming rules. And yet, it's here. Stable, ancient, vibrant. You dip your paddle again. The water parts. The sun flickers through the reeds, and the chinampas, with all their woven bones and muddy hearts, continue to rise from the water, like miracles stitched together with sticks. The sun is higher now, just brushing noon, and the heat starts to gather between the willows. You wipe your brow, suddenly aware of the low buzz circling your ears. Not bees this time, not dragonflies either. No, this buzzing comes with a whine, a high-pitched, sleep-piercing whine. Welcome to the part of chinampa life that no travel guide mentions the bugs. Or more specifically, the fertilizer. You pull your canoe up beside a resting platform, little more than a shaded mat stretched between poles, and sit feet dangling in the cool canal. Around you, bundles of maize husks and squash vines dry in the sun, but the real story here is hidden beneath a simple clay pot half sunk in the mud. It smells pungent, and for good reason, because tonight we're talking Aztec fertilizer. And let's just say it's not the cleanest part of the floating garden fantasy. You may recall the rich, loamy mud from earlier, the dark chocolate-colored stuff that smelled like victory. But that was just the beginning. To keep Chinampas productive, year-round Aztec farmers needed to feed the soil with more than lake gunk. And so they turned to, well, everything else. Kitchen scraps, fish bones, dead leaves, and yes, human waste. That's right. Night soil. Mainstream fact incoming. The Aztecs were one of several early civilizations to use human excrement as a fertilizer, but they did it with real finesse. In cities like Tenochtitlan, public toilets were built over canals where waste could be collected, composted, and later transported by canoe to agricultural areas. It was organized, efficient, and surprisingly hygienic by ancient standards at least. You squirm slightly at the idea, but then again, have you seen how many plastic bags modern fertilizer comes in? Still, it wasn't just human waste. Ash from cooking fires, crushed snail shells, and ground-up bones all found their way into the fields. And for a quirky tidbit, some Chinampa farmers swore by rotting fish heads buried beneath maize rows as a kind of turbo boost for the soil. Yes, it smelled awful. Yes, it worked anyway. The genius here wasn't the ingredients, it was the cycle. Everything got reused. Nothing went to waste. Kitchen trash became garden treasure. Dead fish became breakfast. Even urine collected in jars from households was used to tan hides, clean tools, and in some cases, enrich particularly stubborn plots of land. And don't think the Aztecs were shy about this. There were even special tax collectors for fertilizer. That's right, officials who came by canoe to inspect your compost contributions. Can you imagine the job interview? Tell us about your experience with decomposing organic matter. Historians still argue whether these collections were strictly enforced or more ceremonial. Some believe certain classes were exempt from the stinkier duties, while others insist it was a shared responsibility part of being a good citizen of Tenochtitlan. Either way, if you wanted healthy maize, you had to get your hands dirty. Very dirty. You lie back on the platform, hands behind your head, and watch a bird spiral overhead. A white ibis, maybe. Or just an overachieving goose. The smell of compost is strong here, but oddly comforting. It smells like effort, like purpose. Nearby, a woman stirs a pit of steaming mulch with a wooden paddle. It bubbles just slightly. She wears a cloth over her mouth, not for modesty, but for practicality. The steam rises like the breath of the earth itself. You watch as she scatters crushed obsidian into the mix, not for nutrients, but to ward off insects and rodents. The Aztecs believed sharp minerals kept unwanted spirits and pests at bay. You're not entirely convinced, but you admit fewer rats is always a good thing. The compost pile is not just tolerated, it's honored. Farmers leave small offerings near the piles. A sprig of flowers, a pinch of ground maize, a shard of pottery etched with a sun symbol. To the untrained eye, it looks like trash. But to the Aztecs, it's fertility incarnate. Decay leads to life. Always. You shift uncomfortable, but oddly intrigued. There's something grounding about the whole thing, literally and figuratively. In modern terms, you might call it closed-loop agriculture. But here, it's just how things are done. A canoe pulls up beside you. The man inside wears a woven hat, the brim wide enough to shade a small dog. He has jars in the boat carefully sealed with wax. He nods, grunts, and taps one of the jars twice. You guess it isn't honey. He rows on unfazed by your polite horror. You stand and stretch. The wind shifts slightly, and suddenly the compost smell is gone, replaced by something floral. You follow the scent around the corner of a chinampa and find yourself surrounded by cempasúchil, the Aztec marigold. Bright orange, soft as feathers, and used in everything from death rituals to seasoning tamales. The marigolds love this soil. All that fish gut and night soil, pure magic for flower roots. It's beautiful in its way. A reminder that life blooms brightest where things break down the most. You crouch and pluck a single flower. Its scent is earthy, spicy, ancient. Here's a question to fall asleep to. What if the future of agriculture doesn't look like gleaming towers and vertical farms, but instead like a pile of old fish heads and poop stirred by hand on a floating platform? It's not glamorous, but it works. You sit again at the edge of the platform, letting your feet dangle in the water. A frog leaps past. The wind hums through the corn stalks. You breathe deep, ignoring the faint whiff of decay. That's just the smell of success. Somewhere far off, a flute plays a gentle tune. You close your eyes. The floating farms are still here, and they're still growing. You wake with a gentle start, the kind that comes from dozing in sunlight, not deep sleep. And the first thing you hear is the creak of a paddle against wood. A boat's passing close by its hull, low in the water, weighed down with something bulky and fragrant. You blink, sniff, and realize it's bundles of herbs. Ipazote hoja santa and something else, citrusy, maybe Mexican marigold. It's time to follow the farmers, not to their homes, but through their workday. Chinampa farming isn't just about planting and harvesting. It's about movement, flow, navigation. These aren't fields you walk between. These are plots you paddle between, each one a little green island tethered by water and memory. You step carefully into a waiting canoe, the kind built narrow and long for maximum maneuverability. There's no motor, no rudder, just one paddle carved from local wood, balanced with a worn grip. You push off, gliding slowly into a lane bordered by green walls of maize and climbing beans. The sun dapples the water, and dragonflies hover just above the surface like nature's tiny surveillance drones. You're not alone out here. All around, other canoes move with rhythmic quiet. A young man hauls a load of amaranth in burlap, steering with his hip, while eating from a maize-wrapped tamal. An elderly woman balances clay pots of chili seedlings, each stem sticking out like a little green soldier. There's no traffic jam, no honking, no road rage, just a soft symphony of water against wood. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Many Chinampa farmers worked from sunrise to late afternoon, paddling from one plot to the next, tending to dozens in a single day. Some Chinampas were family-run, passed down through generations. Others were managed communally, especially those growing staples like maize and beans for tribute. Either way, the rhythm was the same paddle. Tend, harvest, paddle again. And now, for the fringe tidbit, certain Chinampa canals were so well ordered that farmers used color-coded flags or floating markers to signal what was planted, what was ready for harvest, and what had been claimed by neighboring families. Think of it like a very low-tech Google Calendar. Some markers were carved wood. Others were little clay glyphs. One particularly strange glyph archaeologists found a chili pepper sticking out of a frog's mouth. No one's entirely sure what that one meant. Probably hot crops do not steal. You round a bend and nearly crash into a child, leaping from one Chinampa to another. He giggles and disappears into the reeds. Ahead, a teenage girl is bent over rows of squash, singing softly. Her voice is low and rhythmic, half lullaby, half mantra. She looks up, briefly waves, and returns to her task. There's something beautifully ordinary about it. No ceremony, no priest, just soil, sun, and time. And that time is measured not in hours, but in paddle strokes. One Chainampa takes 10 strokes to reach, another maybe 30. The canals twist like veins, and knowing them is a skill passed from father to son, mother to daughter. You stare around a cluster of willows and spot a larger boat a trader may be hauling not produce but finished goods. Baskets, obsidian tools, a cage holding 2 very confused turkeys. He nods to you, barely slowing. The water glimmers, shallow and brown. You can see the bottom in places, stones, algae, even the occasional turtle slipping out of view. And here comes another scholarly debate. Some historians believe the canals doubled as fish farms with small weirs and nets set up to trap tilapia and other edible species. Others argue the fish were wild-caught, not cultivated. Either way, protein was never far away for Chinampa farmers. You float past a woman sorting her harvest small tomatoes, avocados, and what looks like axolotl, a now rare edible tuber. She's arranged them into neat piles atop a reed mat and is muttering numbers under her breath. Inventory Aztec style. A man approaches by canoe and they barter without a word, exchanging goods and a nod. The economy here is tactile fluid, unbothered by scrolls or ledgers. You stop to help another farmer just for a minute. He hands you a woven scoop, and together you dredge silt from the canal to pile onto the base of his island. It's heavy, wet, and surprisingly warm. He gestures toward the corn stalks and says something about feeding the mother. You don't need a translation. You feel it. Chinampa life is circular. You don't just grow crops, you rotate, replenish, repair. Nothing is wasted. Even the leftover maize stalks are reused, some as thatch, others burned and spread as ash to deter pests. And yet it's not without its challenges. The heat, the insects, the aching shoulders. You hear someone nearby curse softly in Nahuatl as a basket tips into the water. A dozen chili peppers bob to the surface, looking mildly embarrassed. The moment isn't lost on you. This life is hard, but it's also elegant. You paddle past a shrine built into a Chinampa. Corner, a little clay figure tucked under a stone overhang. Tlaloc, maybe, or Zilanin, goddess of tender maize. The farmers don't stop to pray. The shrine is just there, part of the landscape, like the trees and the birds and the compost. You let the paddle rest and drift. The canal narrows again, framed by high reed walls. The sound fades to just water and birdsong. It's hypnotic. And it strikes you now there are no fences here, no locks, no loud machines. Just floating islands, quiet labor, and a deep, muddy trust in the earth. As you turn toward a shaded patch near the next Chinampa, you spot a farmer napping on a reed mat, hat tipped over his eyes. Dog curled at his feet. His canoe bobs nearby, half filled with squash and small sunflowers. It's a picture of peace until the dog barks and the man jolts upright, swatting at a mosquito with the sleepy precision of a man who's done it 1,000 times before. You smile and paddle onward. The canal stretches ahead, a green artery into the past. By late afternoon, the sun begins its slow descent, painting long shadows across the water. The air cools slightly, the color of the lake shifting from gold to a muted green, and the sounds of the Chinampas take on a new tone. Less chatter, more clatter. Canoes grow heavier with harvest, and the splash of paddles is joined now by the soft thunk of clay jars being stacked and crates being tied down. You glide past one of the main canal intersections, a kind of liquid crossroads, and the traffic picks up. Boats come and go, some moving fast, others bobbing in place, waiting their turn. It's not chaotic, but it is busy. The day is winding down, but the real work, that's just getting started. You trail one canoe in particular. It's long, low, and painted with faint blue symbols that you recognize from temple murals, stylized maze wind glyphs, and what might be a jaguar paw print. The man steering it is broad-shouldered, his cloak slung back to reveal arms coated in sweat and lake dust. And strapped across his back, a makua heitel, a wooden sword embedded with sharp obsidian blades. Not exactly your standard gardening tool. Because here's something people rarely mention when they talk about Aztec farming. Some of the most productive farmers were warriors. Mainstream historical fact, in Aztec society land was assigned not just to commoners or nobles, but to military orders. Elite warriors, especially those who had taken captives in battle, were often granted plots of land, including chinampas, as a reward for their service. These weren't hobby gardens. They were expected to generate tribute and feed the military machine. If you were a jaguar or eagle warrior, you fought on the battlefield, and then you fought weeds back home. You float closer and see more of them, young men weathered and lean, working their fields with short-handled hoes and obsidian-bladed sickles. Their movements are fast, efficient, methodical. Farming, yes, but trained like a drill. The same discipline, the same muscle memory. They cut, they tie, they lift all without wasting a second. One grins and gestures at you, tapping his chest and then pointing to his chinampa. A humble boast. This one's his. He earned it. And judging by the neat rows of beans and the dense canopy of squash blossoms, he knows what he's doing. You nod, unsure how to respond, and keep drifting. Here's a fringe detail for the curious mind warrior chinampas, often bordered key transport canals, not just for easier access, but as a form of subtle defense. In times of political tension or rebellion, these militarized farmers could mobilize fast. Their gardens doubled as outposts, which sounds romantic, until you realize they were also the first ones sent to squelch uprisings. Historians still argue whether these plots were truly owned by the warriors or simply managed on behalf of the state. The Aztec land system was a spaghetti bowl of tribute rights, inheritance laws, and state control. But one thing is clear. If you ate maize in Tenochtitlan, chances are a sword-wielding farmer had something to do with it. You veer slightly to the right, passing through a quieter stretch. This area feels different, less utilitarian, more ceremonial. And then you see why. A small altar rises at the corner of a chinampa, nestled among calla lilies and thick mats of blue-green succulents. Woven mats have been laid around it, and bundles of maize cobs tied with red thread sit at the base. You pause and listen. A low chant hums through the air. From behind the altar, a group of elders begins a quiet offering. They pour a thick, foamy drink pulque onto the earth. A woman sprinkles dried chili powder in small arcs. A man lights a bundle of copal resin, the smoke curling skyward like an invisible rope connecting earth and sky. You're witnessing a tribute ceremony, not to the gods directly, but to the state. These crops aren't for market. They're taxes grown to fulfill quotas demanded by the Aztec rulers. Most Chinampa farmers, even the ones in rural Xochimilco or Chalco, had to provide regular tribute in the form of maize beans, flowers, textiles, or labor. And this wasn't voluntary. A failure to meet tribute often meant land seizure, public punishment, or worse. The calm lake, the humming reeds, the peaceful air, it hides the pressure that beat beneath every harvest. Grow enough, or risk losing everything. You drift on thoughtful now. You pass a group of young boys sorting small bundles of produce, each labeled with glyphs and wrapped in soft cloth. One bundle contains chilies, another sweet potatoes, another bundles of bright orange cempasúchil flowers. These will all go into tribute boats and be hauled to Tenochtitlan's central collection points, where imperial stewards will weigh, count, and redistribute everything according to a system so complex it would make a modern supply chain manager sweat. One of the boys notices you watching and waves. You wave back and catch a smile, one without any teeth, just gums and laughter. In the distance, bells ring small, metallic, probably hung from a wooden arch. A signal, perhaps, that the day's tribute is being gathered. You notice canoes veering toward the sound, each carrying carefully sorted produce or cloth or firewood. And suddenly it strikes you, this isn't just farming. It's civic duty, it's spiritual, it's survival. Every Chinampa is a contract with the state, the gods, and the earth itself. You pass one more field on your way back. This one is run down, overgrown. The willows are bent and leafless, the soil crusted with salt. A pair of sandals hang on a fence post, abandoned. It's a ghost plot, a reminder of what happens when land is left untended. Or perhaps taken. There's a stillness to it. A lesson. The wind shifts again. The lake darkens, and your paddle dips once more into the water, steady and sure. You're not just floating through history. You're floating through obligation. As the sun dips lower, casting coppery reflections across the canals, you drift into a quieter quarter of the lake, one that smells a little sweeter and looks softer. The rows of maize and squash are gone now. In their place, flowers. Marigolds, dahlias, calla lilies, bougainvillea. Thick bouquets of color bloom from chinampas on every side. Their petals curl like whispers, catching the light in delicate halos. There are no baskets of beans here, no heavy crates, just the hum of bees and the occasional giggle of someone stringing together flower garlands under the shade of a bent willow. This is the other half of the Chinampa world, the one not meant to feed bodies but to feed rituals, gods, and memory. Welcome to the floral farms of the Aztec Empire. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Not all Chinampas were used for food crops. A significant portion, particularly near ceremonial centers and temples, were reserved for ornamental and ritual flowers. These blooms were essential for religious offerings, festivals, funerals, and courtship rituals. In fact, the Nahua word for flower, xochitl, appears in countless Aztec names, poems, and prayers. For the Aztecs, flowers weren't just pretty, they were sacred. You float past a narrow Chinampa, where two women weave garlands of marigolds. They don't speak. Their fingers move quickly, automatically threading each orange bloom through strips of agave fiber. Nearby, a child hums a melody while picking calla lilies, careful not to bruise the soft white trumpets. And here comes your fringe tidbit. Certain flowers grown on Chinampas were believed to have magical or aphrodisiac properties. One in particular, Tlilelxo-Xitl, was considered sacred, and yes, it's the ancestor of modern vanilla. It was brewed into drinks burned as incense or given as a courting gift, but only in small amounts. Too much, they said, and you dream of jaguars and never wake up. Some historians still argue whether these floral chinampas were state-controlled or privately operated by temple orders. It's possible that high-ranking priestesses managed their own flower plots, tending them with ceremonial precision. Others suggest that floral tribute was a way for poor farmers who couldn't produce large food yields to still participate in state obligations. Either way, the result is breathtaking. You drift past a chinampa thick with cempasúchil, the marigold of the dead. Its golden orange hue glows in the low light. These flowers were laid on altars during festivals, placed on the bodies of the deceased and scattered in water to guide spirits. They bloom not for the living, but for the unseen. As your canoe glides along, you spot a procession of children in white tunics walking a narrow reed path between two plots. Each carries a bundle of flowers. At the front, a girl barely taller than the reeds holds a clay bowl filled with burning copal. Smoke trails behind her like a ribbon curling over the water. They're heading toward a small stone altar at the end of the canal, where a figure of Xochiquetzal, goddess of beauty and fertility, sits draped in garlands. You pause, not wanting to intrude. Their voices lift in soft harmony, a simple chant that rises and falls like the sway of lily pads. No one rushes. No one speaks above a whisper. This isn't performance. It's presence. A woman beside the altar sprinkles petals into the water. Each one floats tiny boats of color drifting in your direction. You lean forward and gently scoop one up. It's warm from the sun, fragrant and impossibly delicate. A single breath could destroy it. Suddenly, this place feels even more unreal, an empire built not just on war and tribute, but on beauty, on color, on honoring things too fragile to last and too important to forget. You paddle on, turning down a new canal framed by dahlias, another Aztec treasure. Their blooms are big, bold, and dramatic, like the florists of the flower world had something to prove. These weren't just decorative. Dahlias were used for dyes, for medicine, even food. Their tubers, starchy and nutrient-rich, could be boiled or roasted. Yes, that's right. You could eat them. Flower tacos, anyone. As the floral chinampas pass, you begin to notice another kind of offering, papel picado. Delicately cut paper flags strung between willow branches. They flutter in the breeze, their shapes casting dancing shadows on the soil below. Suns, skulls, maize stalks, butterflies, all cut by hand, all dissolving slightly in the humidity. And you know what else. These chinampas smell incredible. You'd almost forgotten about the compost and fish guts of earlier. Here it's all jasmine, wet earth, and that vague peppery scent that always comes from crushed marigolds. It's the kind of smell that lingers in fabric and hair that makes everything around it feel a little more sacred. You pass another chinampa and hear laughter. A young couple sits at the edged feet in the water, weaving flower crowns together. She places hers on his head. He complains it's too tight. She laughs harder. You don't speak their words, but the tone is universal. It's the language of flirtation, of spring, of things blooming, and maybe lasting. Because here's the thing, for all their power, the Aztecs knew how to honor softness. Their poetry, their songs, their ceremonies, so many centered on flowers, on fleeting beauty, on the idea that even empires like petals will fall. As your boat rounds the last flower-strewn bend, the light begins to fade into indigo. The floral chinampas quiet. The chants stop. The breeze slows, and behind you, the petals on the water drift in silence. The floating gardens still grow, and tonight they bloom for memory. Evening now. Not quite full darkness, but the lake is slipping into its indigo phase water, turning deep blue sky stitched with early stars. You trail your fingers through the surface, and for a brief moment, it almost feels like silk. You're floating into Xochimilco, though the name won't mean much yet. Right now, it's just a wider stretch of water surrounded by chinampas that seem to glow in the dusk. These are the survivors, the last beating heart of the ancient system still pulsing on the southern edge of modern Mexico City. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Xochimilco is the final remnant of the vast Chinampa network that once covered Lake Texcoco. While most of the original lake has long since been drained or paved over, Xochimilco's chinampas have somehow miraculously endured. They've been farmed continuously for over 700 years. You don't need a time machine to see them. You're in a canoe now drifting slowly past them, the night breeze cool on your face. But things have changed. Instead of obsidian-bladed sickles, you spot rusted shovels. Instead of reed mats, there are blue tarps stretched over beds of lettuce. And somewhere off to your left, the sound of a mariachi band echoes faintly over the water. Yes, mariachi. Because while Xochimilco still farms, it also parties. You pass a brightly painted boat, a trajinera, it's called, decked out in neon lights and fake flowers. Teenagers laugh, clink bottles, dance off rhythm to a tinny speaker blaring cumbia. You're caught between two worlds now, the ancient and the almost too modern. And here comes your fringe tidbit. The trajineras, those colorful party barges, are direct descendants of the original Chinampa canoes. They were once used to ferry produce, compost, and even people to market. Now, they mostly ferry birthday cakes, tequila, and Instagram influencers. Historians still argue whether this transformation is cultural erosion or cultural adaptation. Some mourn the commercialization. Others say if it floats and people love it, it's still alive. You try not to judge. One moment, you're watching a girl drunkenly wave a sparkler. The next, your canoe passes a man in silence, knees deep in a chinampa, planting spring onions by moonlight. Somehow, it all coexists. You paddle past a sign half submerged in reed sea, vend Romero rosemary for sale. There's a faded phone number scrawled beneath. The handwriting is neat practiced. This chinampa sells herbs to upscale restaurants in the city. The chef doesn't come here, of course. A delivery truck waits at the pier. But the soil, it's the same soil that once fed emperors. The air here is different, softer, quieter, and then suddenly movement. A pale shape glides just under the surface. Not a fish, too wide, too smooth. You lean forward, eyes squinting, and catch it just before it disappears under a clump of duckweed. An axolotl. You've heard of them. Little aquatic salamanders with feathery gills and grumpy smiles. Native only to these canals. Once a staple food, now nearly extinct, but not gone. And here's the kicker, these creatures were once so common that farmers had to build fences to keep them out of crops. Now they're bred in labs, studied in universities, and adored on T-shirts. You spot another sign, Centro de Conservación del Axolote, a floating lab on a chinampa, part greenhouse, part aquarium. Inside, dimly lit tanks glow blue and green. You drift closer, peer through the glass, and watch one axolotl stare back at you with its eternally surprised face. What's it thinking? Probably nothing. But it floats there like a relic, proof that something fragile can still endure even when its world disappears. You look up again and realize just how much the lake has changed. The water's edge is now lined with concrete walls in places. In others, there's trash caught between the reeds, bottle caps, plastic forks, the occasional abandoned flip-flopper. The magic is still here, yes, but it has to fight for space now. And yet it fights. You pass another farm plot. This one's lush wild even. Tomatoes spill from the trellises. Basil crowds the walkways. A hand-painted sign reads, Agroecologia Milpa Viva, Living Milpa Agroecology. This isn't a museum, it's a revival. Young farmers are coming back. Students, artists, environmentalists. People who see chinampas not just as history, but as the future. They work by hand, no chemicals. They dredge mud like their ancestors. Compost kitchen scraps. Worship worms. You see them now, headlamps bobbing in the twilight as they water seedlings with clay jugs. One wipes her forehead and sips from a reused soda bottle. Another stops to take a photo of a flower blooming near the edge of the plot. It's quiet again. Just crickets now, and the occasional plunk of something falling into the water, a frog maybe, or a fig. You slow the canoe. Ahead, a chinampa stretches out long and narrow, freshly turned soil, still wet and black. A single torch flickers at the far end, casting shadows that sway like dancers on the surface of the lake. And for a moment, just a moment, it could be 1450 again. No lights, no phones, no party boats. Just you, the torch, the water, and the land. The floating farms are still here, just barely. But still, you drift a little farther, letting your paddle rest. The surface of the canal reflects everything now. Stars torchlight shadows, and for a second, you feel suspended between two skies. Above you, the constellations. Beneath you, their watery twins. You're not here just to watch. You're here to understand. And now that you've seen the flowers, the food, the frog-faced warriors, it's time to talk about what makes chinampas not only beautiful or ancient, but shockingly, almost annoyingly modern. Because here's your mainstream fact: chinampas were one of the most sustainable agricultural systems ever created. No fossil fuels, no synthetic fertilizers, no pesticides, and yet they produced year-round food at industrial scale. They were, quite literally, climate-adapted agriculture, centuries before the phrase ever hit a TED Talk. Picture it. Raised beds built from organic waste, water management through gravity, not pumps, composting at a near religious level, flood mitigation through controlled canal grids, crop rotation baked into the calendar, and all of it completely circular. What you took from the lake, you returned to the land. What rotted became new life. What bloomed fed the body and the spirit. You paddle past a chinampa lined with squash vines and corn stalks, and if you squint, it almost looks like a modern urban garden. Except here, no plastic planter boxes, no Instagram reels, just woven reeds and generations of whispered knowledge. And now for your quirky tidbit. Aztec farmers were such obsessive recyclers that broken pottery was often ground into the soil to improve drainage and aeration. That's right. Your cracked soup bowl wasn't trash. It was a soil amendment. Your broken molcajete earth food. Historians still debate whether chinampas were intended to be scalable beyond the Valley of Mexico. Some argue they were hyper-local, dependent on the lake's unique ecology. Others believe they were deliberately replicated in smaller lakes across the empire. There's even some evidence that chinampa principles were adopted quietly by later colonial systems. Like a good trick that nobody wants to admit wasn't theirs. But back to you here now. Your canoe scrapes gently against the edge of a particularly lush chinampa. It's almost jungle-like thick, with leaves dripping with dew. The farmer who tends this plot is nowhere to be seen, but their presence is unmistakable. Everything is in balance. Not neat exactly, but intentional. A wild order. Tomatoes climb corn stalks. Beans coil like lazy snakes. Companion planting at its most poetic. You think about the industrial farms you've seen from airplane windows, grids so vast they seem alien. And then you look around at this, an island no wider than a country lane. No longer than a football field, and you realize this fed empires. This little green patch, multiplied across hundreds of miles, kept cities alive. And it did it without exhausting the soil, without poisoning the rivers, without needing trucks, planes, or quarterly profit reports. You pass another canoe, this one steered by a man your age. He has a headlamp, a quiet smile, and a basket full of radishes and small purple eggplants. He's on his way to an overnight market. He nods to you, then paddles off, quiet as the moon. Yes, the moon. It's full now, high overhead, casting a soft silver sheen on everything. You notice things more clearly in this light, the way the willows lean like tired elders, the shimmer of dew on the squash leaves, the slow bobbing of tiny fireflies, rising from the damp soil like sparks from a slow-burning log. You pull up to the side and step onto a chinampa to stretch. The ground is firm but spongy, a perfect compromise. You crouch and scoop up a handful of soil. It smells of crushed leaves, old rain, and secrets. You press it between your fingers and feel its aliveness. Microbes, insects, fungi, all working silently to make sure corn grows tall and chilies grow hot. And then you hear something behind you. Not a noise exactly, more like a lack of noise. A stillness, a hush. You turn, a deer. Small, alert, frozen mid-step. It stares at you. You stare back. The moment stretches, and then it bounds away silent as a prayer, vanishing into the reeds. You sit there a moment longer, heart still. Then you chuckle. You didn't expect this much wilderness out here. But that's part of the brilliance. Chinampas weren't just farms, they were ecosystems. Frogs, birds, insects, snakes, even fish and mammals, they all played roles. Pollinators, pest controllers, fertilizer contributors. Dinner sometimes. And no part was wasted. Even the weeds were useful. Some were edible, others medicinal. Some were burned and added back into the soil. Others were left alone, entirely serving as natural insect repellents. The Aztecs didn't fight the environment. They partnered with it. A breeze brushes past, cooler now. You hear water lapping softly against the canoe. Somewhere nearby, a nightbird trills. Another answers. You close your eyes. You could stay here for hours. And someone once lived here, farmed here, laughed here. They rose with the sun, turned the soil, thanked the lake, cursed the mosquitoes, honored the gods. And when they died, they were buried nearby, their bones feeding the same earth that fed them. The system continues. The water flows. The Shinampas rise. And even now, centuries later, they still whisper in green. Night has fully arrived. The stars are sharp now, scattered across the velvet sky like crushed salt. The moon sits heavy and low, glowing with the kind of authority only ancient moons seem to have, like it's seen all of this before. Which of course it has. You paddle slowly, letting the silence wrap around you. The wind has died down. The reeds have stopped rustling. Even the frogs, bold little troubadours that they are, have lowered their chorus to a sleepy croak. It's as if the whole lake is holding its breath. And just then you smell it. Smoke. Not fire, not danger. Just the soft, familiar scent of wood smoke wafting across the water. You follow your nose, pulling your canoe gently around a bend, and there it is, a small cooking fire at the edge of a chinampa. Clay pots arranged neatly on a stone hearth. A woman crouches over one, stirring with a long wooden spoon. The light flickers across her face, painting it with warmth and shadow. She looks up and nods, not surprised to see you. Not surprised at all. You dock the canoe quietly, careful not to rock the boat literally, and step onto the soil. It's warmer than you expect. Dry on top, moist beneath like a well-made cake left out in the sun. She doesn't say anything, just hands you a clay cup. You sip. It's a toll, a warm, thick drink made from ground maize, cinnamon, and a touch of vanilla. Sweet, earthy, slightly gritty. Comfort in liquid form. You sit beside the fire. She stirs the pot. The embers crackle. This is how the Aztec world ended its day. Not with grand temples or drums or battles, but with quiet routine. A fire, a meal, a watchful moon, and a deep, deep knowing that tomorrow the lake would still be there. So would the crops. So would the work. But don't be fooled. This calm hides a history of strain. Because not everything in Chinampa life was balanced and serene. The very thing that made the system so powerful, its connection to water, was also what made it vulnerable. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Lake Texcoco was naturally unstable. Shallow, saline, and prone to flooding, it could turn from cooperative to catastrophic with one heavy rain season. The Aztecs knew this, so they built dikes, levees, and sluice gates to manage it, huge feats of hydrological engineering that controlled where fresh and salt water mixed. But you know how lakes are. They don't care about your architecture. And here's your fringe tidbit. Some researchers believe that a particularly bad flood in the late 1400s, one that breached dikes and ruined multiple Chinampa zones, may have spurred a brief food crisis in Tenochtitlan. The city recovered quickly, but it exposed a weakness. When the water rebelled, the empire trembled. You shift on your seat as the woman passes you a Tamil wrapped in a green leaf. It's hot, fragrant, filled with beans and a whisper of chili. You take a bite and it nearly melts. Simple. Perfect. This is food built from mud and math, sweat and sunlight. And it almost disappeared, because then came the Spanish. Historians still argue about exactly how much of the Chinampa system was destroyed during the conquest. Some say most of it collapsed due to war and disease. Others blame the post-conquest drainage projects designed to tame the chaotic lake once and for all. You take another bite. The woman says nothing. She doesn't need to. Behind her, half the Chinampa is in shadow. The trees sway. The water reflects firelight. You remember reading once that when the Spanish arrived, they saw the Chinampas and thought them floating gardens of illusion. Beautiful, but not real. As if the very idea of growing food on water offended their European sensibilities. So they drained the lake. Or tried to. Buried it in stone. Turned farmland into dry land. Built their churches and their mansions and their systems. Concrete over compost. And still some Chinampas held on. You look around this plot, quiet and alive. There are marks of modern life here, a plastic bucket, a pair of rubber boots, but the bones are ancient. The technique hasn't changed. The earth still holds water. The willow roots still stretch deep. The soil still sighs when pressed. And maybe that's the lesson. Empires fall. Markets crash. But Mud remembers. You finish your atoll and set the cup down. The woman nods again, soft, wordless permission to leave. You stand, stretch, and walk slowly back to your canoe. The fire crackles behind you, fading as you push back into the canal. The night is heavier now. The stars blur slightly in the water. Your arms move slow, lazy with warmth and starch. You pass another Chinampa, this one half submerged. The trees are dead, the soil caved in. Abandoned. A casualty of neglect or rising water, or maybe just time. It leans sideways like a memory half forgotten. But beside it another plot is thriving. Beans climbing corn, squash curling across the bank. Life pressed up against loss like 2 pages of a book stuck together. You paddle on. The torchlight fades. The moon lingers. And the Chinampas, those quiet marvels of mud and invention, keep floating even now, even still. The lake is silent now, as if someone reached up and pulled a blanket over the world. You're drifting slowly, not so much steering anymore, as being carried by water, by wind, by whatever force has kept this floating world alive through centuries of chaos. But make no mistake, for all its calm, this place didn't last forever, because nothing gold or green can stay. It started with small cracks, a few bad harvests, some suspicious erosion. And then, as the pressure of empire mounted and the Spanish foothold tightened, the delicate balance of the Chinampa system began to unravel. Let's get to the mainstream historical fact after the fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521. The Spanish conquest didn't just topple temples and rename towns, it altered landscapes. Lake Texcoco was declared a problem. Too wet, too wild, too indigenous. Over the next centuries, Spanish and colonial engineers embarked on massive drainage projects aiming to transform the Valley of Mexico into a more European-style landscape, dry, manageable, bordered by fences instead of canals. They dug channels, built tunnels, tore through the dikes and levees the Aztecs had so painstakingly constructed. The lake began to recede year by year, like a memory fading in reverse. You pass a Chinampa, where the water is barely ankle deep. The soil is cracked at the edges. The willow roots stick out like bones. You imagine a farmer here standing where you are now, watching the lake vanish beneath their toes. And here's the kicker: the land didn't become more fertile. It became dust, dry, salty, and hard. The very thing that had made Chinampas work the constant hydration from below was gone. The Chinampas became regular plots, then fields, then empty. But here's your fringe tidbit for all their flooding erosion and forced abandonment. Chinampas never disappeared entirely. In fact, small communities resisted the drainage efforts, patching levees in secret, digging small canals at night, and clinging to their floating plots like sailors on rafts. Historians still argue whether this resistance was purely practical. After all, the Chinampa method was far more productive than dry farming, or if it was also cultural defiance. A quiet refusal to let centuries of knowledge be drowned under colonial ambition. Either way, some Chinampas survived. They shrank, they cracked, they adapted. But they endured. You paddle past another ghost plot, this one fenced in with barbed wire, a sad replacement for willow hedges. The reeds have been replaced with invasive weeds. An old sign nailed to a tree says, "Propiedad privada." The tree is dead. The sign is rusted. The soil looks thin and gray. But then around a bend you hear laughter. You follow it and find a family seated on a platform at the edge of a restored Chinampa. The matriarch stirs a pot of something rich and bubbling. 2 children string flower garlands. A teenage boy tends a compost pile, tossing in orange peels and crushed eggshells. A solar lamp glows beside them, warm and constant. The Chinampa here is thriving. You can smell it, fresh basil wet earth smoke. The soil is dark, the crops lush, the canal deep enough to reflect the stars. And now, for another twist in the 20th century, the Mexican government tried to formalize Chinampa farming, declaring Xochimilco a heritage site and launching restoration programs. Some were half-hearted. Others sabotaged by urban developers. But a few worked. In recent years, there's been a Chinampa renaissance, a slow, stubborn return to ancient wisdom. Agroecologists, conservationists, even chefs have started investing in these plots, reviving old seeds using ancestral compost techniques, and mapping out where the canals can be reopened. But it's not simple. The threats are everywhere: pollution, illegal settlements, real estate pressure. Some Chinampas now sit under highways. Others are buried beneath trash dumps. You pass one of those dumps now. A low hill barely visible in the dark, covered in scrub grass and plastic wrappers. This too was once water, once mud, once a garden. You look away. The canal narrows again, pulling you into a quieter space. A man fishes at the edge using a line wrapped around a soda bottle. He reels in a small tilapia, nods to himself, and tosses it into a pail. Survival doesn't always wear a loincloth. Sometimes it wears a hoodie. You pause the canoe. The water beneath you is thick with algae, glowing faintly in the moonlight. You can almost hear it breathe. Because here's the truth: the Chinampa system didn't fail. It was interrupted. It was slashed, drained, paved, and regulated into near extinction. But the logic of it, the brilliance of using water and mud to feed millions, that never stopped making sense. In fact, as the world warms, as droughts worsen and topsoil erodes, more and more scientists and activists are turning back to these ancient plots. To the lake, to the mud, to the floating farms of the past as a key to surviving the future. You paddle again slowly now, not from fatigue, from reverence. The trees rustle, the water shimmers. You hear a splash, an axolotl maybe, or a fish, or a god. Because if gods ever lived anywhere, it was here in the wet green silence between rows of maize. Not in palaces, not in pyramids, but in the hands of farmers, turning soil year after year, through flood and fire and empire and collapse. You close your eyes, and for a moment you don't feel like you're visiting history. You feel like you've always been here, floating, listening, growing. The stars have shifted overhead, drawing new constellations as you glide through the darkness. You're not paddling now, just drifting, letting the slow current guide you. And somewhere beneath the reflection of the moon, the truth lies buried. Not in legend, in literal, actual soil. Because for every Chinampa still standing there are a dozen more that disappeared not just under asphalt or development, but under time, water, and silence. Their knowledge, more than their structures, was what nearly vanished. You pass a Chinampa, now barely visible, just a faint rise in the water, held together by the last stubborn roots of an ancient willow. You wonder who farmed here. What did they plant? What did they know? And then, you remember, no one really wrote it down. Mainstream historical fact, most Chinampa knowledge was oral. Passed from family to family, elder to child farmer to apprentice. There were no official manuals, no architectural plans. The genius of the system lived in calloused hands and quiet habits. When the conquest came, those voices, along with millions of others, fell silent. But here's a curious thing. The Chinampas didn't go down without leaving clues. Archaeologists digging through the outskirts of Mexico City have found the ghosts of Chinampas. Layers of packed mud, distinct soil patterns, and traces of organic compost that defy normal agricultural logic. Some plots even preserve the outlines of reed foundations or willow post holes, an ancient architectural blueprint etched in earth. Here's your fringe tidbit. One team uncovered a series of preserved Chinampa rows beneath a modern parking lot, so well-ordered and rich with carbon residue that the soil is still more fertile than most commercial farmland today. Still, historians argue whether these ghost plots can tell us everything we've lost. A few measurements, some pollen samples, a scatter of bone fragments. It's not the same as knowing which tree to plant on the edge, or which mix of lake mud and ash deters worms, or how to balance a boat with 3 baskets of maize and 1 sleeping toddler. You drift past another plot, this one deliberately reconstructed by ecologists. It's beautiful, yes, but somehow a little too perfect, too straight, too intentional. The soul you feel lies somewhere else, in the crooked corners, the half-sunk basket, the way a willow leans as if it's listening. Because this wasn't a science, it was a relationship. A contract between humans and a fickle lake. You think back to the priests and tribute boats and flower altars, but also to the fish bones in the soil, the compost jars in canoes, and the worn paddles passed from father to son. All of it mattered, every part. And then another memory resurfaces. Not yours, of course, but a borrowed one. In the 1800s, after centuries of suppression, a few rural farmers still practiced Chinampa techniques in secret. Not because they were told to, but because they knew it worked. They hid compost piles in reed bundles. They repaired dikes at night. They whispered planting calendars like prayers. You pass a shrine now half swallowed by weeds. The figure has no face weathered down to a smooth nub. But someone's still lighting candles here, still leaving petals, still remembering. And the question hangs in the humid night, how much wisdom have we paved over? You steer gently toward a wider stretch of canal where the water darkens. No lights, no noise, just the creak of your canoe. You're floating over what was once a dense network of shinampas, miles of life now erased. The sadness settles in, but then soft laughter. On the far bank, a small group of university students sits around a low fire sipping atole, passing tamales wrapped in cloth. You recognize the language Spanish, but laced with Nahuatl words. One of them reads aloud from a worn notebook a fragment of a farming chant, recorded by an elder decades ago. You pause, breath caught in your throat. This is how knowledge comes back. Not all at once, not in perfect form, but slowly, patchily, like roots regrowing under broken pavement. One student looks up, notices your boat and waves. You wave back. Not just in greeting, but in gratitude. Because this story isn't just about loss. It's about return. Every year, a few more shinampas are restored. A few more farmers come back. A few more children learn how to dig the right way, plant, at the right time honor the land without overworking it. The past isn't gone, it's buried. And what's buried can still grow. You drift onward. The breeze carries scents of earth and ash. A heron lifts into the air without sound. And in the dark, the Shinampa plots seem to rearrange themselves not just as land, but as language. A quiet grammar of survival. An old sentence repeated over centuries. Here you grow. Here you give back. You smile. Because even the forgotten things, the ones buried under parking lots and silence, have roots. And they're still reaching. The night is long, now deep and still, but not lifeless. The Shinampas keep breathing. The water keeps whispering. And somewhere ahead, you see a faint light, a glow that isn't fire or moon, but something electric. Modern. You paddle toward it, and suddenly, you're no longer in ancient Xochimilco or post-conquest Mexico. You're gliding past a rooftop greenhouse in Brooklyn where tomato vines curl through recycled gutter pipes. Past a floating garden in Bangladesh, lashed together with banana tree trunks and water hyacinth. Past a concrete lot in Los Angeles where plastic bins teem with leafy greens and worms wriggle through homemade compost. This isn't a fantasy. It's a revival. Mainstream fact, in recent decades, urban farmers around the world have begun to reclaim and reimagine ancient techniques, including Chinampa-like systems. Whether due to climate change, food insecurity, or just sheer curiosity, people are looking backward to move forward, rediscovering how to grow food in places where traditional agriculture has failed. And Chinampas, they're the gold standard. You pause beside a floating plot not in Mexico now, but in a constructed wetlands project outside Hanoi. Bamboo frames, floating rafts of organic material, children in school uniforms tending bok choy. It's not called a Shinampa here, but the principle is the same. Raised growing surfaces, canal-based access, water-fed roots, compost, local wisdom. And here's your fringe detail. In 2019, a team of researchers in Mexico City began experimenting with neo-chinampas, urban farming beds modeled after the Aztec system, but adapted for small-scale community gardens. They used geotextiles instead of reeds, rainwater catchment systems instead of lake canals, and compost bins made from shipping pallets. The results yields rivaled industrial farming with 90% less water usage and virtually no chemical inputs. You smile. Because of course it works. It always worked. The system didn't break. The world just forgot. Historians still argue whether Chinampas can be widely scaled in modern cities. Some say they're too space-intensive. Others believe they're the blueprint for climate-resilient micro-farming, especially in flood-prone areas. What's clear is this nature remembers, and when we listen, it answers. You float now past images, not places, but moments. A woman in Nairobi stacking compost into a vertical Chinampa frame. A permaculture class in Toronto studying Aztec planting calendars. A chef in Sao Paulo plating Chinampa-raised amaranth leaves next to a swirl of mole Negro telling his customers they're eating like gods. In each scene there's something else too. Hope. Because here's the magic of Chinampas. They offer a vision that isn't just sustainable, it's beautiful. It's quiet. It feeds the body and the soul. And in a world that moves too fast, grows too loud, and breaks things before it understands them, that matters. You pass a modern farm school. Kids gather around a raised bed, hands dirty, eyes wide. A teacher holds up a laminated drawing maize bean squash. The three sisters. The kids laugh when she calls squash the chubby one. But they'll remember. They always do. You glide further and realize something profound. The future of Chinampas isn't about restoration. It's about reinvention. These floating gardens aren't relics. They're templates. Prototypes from the past waiting to be rebooted for the now. You paddle past a tech startup's aquaponics lab. Glass walls, LEDs, but the design straight from the lake. Tiered beds, fish tanks cycling nutrient-rich water, compost tea dripping into hydroponic roots. The founders talk about ancient solutions to modern crises, and while their uniforms may be Patagonia fleece instead of woven cotton, the mission feels familiar. Grow more, waste less, float when the world floods. A mist rolls across the water, soft and cool. The stars above begin to thin. Dawn is coming. You pass one last image. A woman on a restored Chinampa near Mexico City, turning the soil with a handmade wooden tool. She's alone, focused, humming softly. The air around her buzzes with bees and memory. At her feet, a young willow takes root. A reed basket leans nearby, half full of marigold blossoms. She doesn't speak to you, but her presence says everything. It says we never stopped. We just paused. You turn your canoe back toward the center of the lake, where the sky begins to pink at the edges. Birds stir. A fish jumps, scattering light. Your reflection stares back at you in the water, older now. Wiser, covered in mud and wonder. And you realize Chinampas are more than a farming technique. They're a metaphor for resilience, for rebirth, for remembering that what we bury can still bloom. You don't know when exactly the night passed into morning, but it has. The lake is waking up, not with fanfare, but with little things. A breeze that wasn't there before. The rustle of reeds. The soft creak of a canoe being unmoored from its peg. You paddle slower now, not out of fatigue, but because you don't want to leave. The canal ahead winds like a lazy snake through still shadowed Chinampas, and every inch seems to whisper, "Stay a little longer." You pass a man kneeling in his garden bed, hands in the dirt before the light even breaks fully. No gloves, no machines, just skin to soil. He presses his palms flat like he's asking the earth a question, and maybe he is. You've seen the system, felt the mud touch the roots, watched the balance, and what strikes you now, more than anything else, is how fragile it all is, how utterly human. Here's your final mainstream historical fact. At its peak, the Chinampa system provided up to 60% of the produce consumed in Tenochtitlan. One method built without iron or electricity supported a metropolis of hundreds of thousands. But it wasn't invincible. Floods, conquest, disease, neglect all tried to erase it. And yet here you are. You trail your hand in the water again. It's warmer now. A heron lands on a nearby log with a silent glide. Somewhere behind you, the sound of a paddle strikes water in perfect rhythm. Work has begun. Let's talk legacy. What do you remember? Is it the floating gardens themselves, neat rows of maize and flowers perched atop woven beds of lake mud, or the women tying chili bundles under the canopy of willows? Or maybe it's the compost, the ash, the jars of night soil that oddly stayed with you more than you expected. Or is it the feeling, that sensation of a system where every part has a place where nothing is wasted, and where growing food is as much ritual as labor? You pass a shrine small and worn. A single maize cob is laid beneath it like an offering. The cob is imperfect, half-eaten. Ants crawl along the husk. But it's beautiful, because it means someone cared enough to place it there. Now for your last fringe tidbit, there's evidence that Chinampa farmers used song cycles, sung work chants passed from generation to generation, meant to guide planting rhythms and praise the earth. One fragment recorded by colonial scribes translates roughly to, "We rise with the maize, we sleep in the roots." You smile. You don't need a full translation. You understand it now in your bones. Historians still argue even today whether the Chinampa system should be revived, replicated, or left to rest. But maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe Chinampas never left. Maybe they just sank for a while, waiting for the right hands to lift them again. You see them now, those hands. Young, old, calloused, manicured. Some grasping wooden tools, others holding iPhones. All planting something, not just crops, but continuity. You look up. The sun is just beginning to crack the horizon. It bleeds through the willows in golden lines. The water shimmers. Somewhere nearby, a baby cries. A dog barks. A bird calls the world awake. It's time to go. But before you do, you pause your boat in the center of the canal. You sit still. You breathe deep. The air smells like wet dirt, sweet smoke, crushed leaves. And as the first full beam of sunlight touches the surface of the lake, you whisper just once, "Thank you for the mud, for the roots, for remembering what the world tried so hard to forget." So now, just sit with that. Let your shoulders relax. Let your fingers uncurl. There's no need to paddle anymore. You're just floating. Imagine the water cradling the canoe. Cool, quiet, perfectly still. The Chinampas stretching out on either side like green arms around a dream. Willow leaves drift slowly past, and dragonflies hum their soft lullabies over your head. The work is done. The soil has been turned. The songs have been sung. Everything planted is now in the care of the earth. There's nothing left to carry. You lie back. The canoe rocks gently. Your breath slows. Your thoughts soften. Somewhere nearby, a torch flickers low in the morning wind. A bird rustles in the reeds. The water murmurs something only you can hear. You don't need to understand every part of the story. You only need to know that it's still being written. That somewhere, even now, someone is bending low over the earth, rebuilding what was lost, remembering what still grows, returning what was borrowed. The Chinampas are there, quiet, waiting. You are drifting, not away, but back, back to stillness, back to soil, back to sleep. Good night.